Gulf Travel Show presents an exclusive interaction between CEO of DDP Publications and the President of HVS Middle East, Africa and South Asia.
Hello, everyone. We know what's happening today across the globe. We are all the countries across the world, we all into what I personally call a world war, because this whole pandemic has spread everywhere and every nation is trying to save its nationals and trying to see how they can safely stay and yet do business, because the business has taken a big beating. Some of the industries are really struggling, and of course, since we all in the travel and tourism industry, we know we are struggling very hard, and it is actually this pandemic has brought the travel and tourism industry down on its knees. That's what is happening at the moment. I wish we knew what the future lies. We knew what is going to happen. And for that reason, I wish we had a crystal ball and we could see the crystal ball and predict the future. So we don't have a crystal ball with us, but we have somebody we have as our guest today who understands this very well, and she knows what's happening in the market. So we're going to ask her to act as a crystal ball for us today and predict and let us know what's basically going to happen in the future. So friends, it gives me great pleasure to today welcome Hala Matar Shofani. She's the president of HVS Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, and the managing partner of HVS Dubai. Hala has an in-depth expertise in regional hotel markets and has advised on more than 2,500 hospitality and mixed-use projects in the last 15 years across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Incidentally, Hala completed her executive education at Harvard Business School. That's brilliant. And she also holds an MBA in finance and strategy from the Cornell University. Welcome, Hala. It's a pleasure to have you here and honor, and we really would look at hearing from you what you have to do. We have a few questions, but before I ask you some questions, I'm going to give the floor to you for a minute or two. Let's hear your starting comments and what you think what's happening around in the industry. So over to you. Let's hear your starting points. Hala.
Thank you, Sanjeet, for the introduction. But also, I must say, you've given me a big responsibility today with trying really to understand. I mean, we know where we are today now. I guess, as you rightly said, it's all about where do we go from here. So I may not necessarily claim to have all the answers, but I'm more than happy, obviously, to share with you and anyone tuning in what my own assessment of the current status quo, but also how the hospitality industry is likely to evolve. And I guess we're all at the moment trying to understand timing. We're trying to understand impact, not necessarily current impact, but the prolonged impact. And what is it that ultimately we could do in order to save that industry? So I'm happy to answer any specific questions. But generally speaking, I mean, perhaps what I'd like to say a couple of months ago, and some time ago, actually, back in April, when I first tried to look at the recovery model, and I had put some forecasts based on really looking at demand dynamics, demand generators, what the different governments, at least in this part of the world, were looking to do. And I had come out with, again, not claiming that I know the answer, but I did feel like it may take us well into 24, 25 in order to achieve full recovery. I must tell you, that's a good question, Sanjeet. I had a lot of friends that called me up and say, since when you're so pessimistic? I mean, you're an optimistic person. What are you talking about, 24, 25? But then fast forward, sadly and unfortunately, this is what we seem to hear from the ones that are pretty much supporting the hospitality sector, be it the airline business. So when we look at what their predictions are, be it also the governments, but generally speaking, there seems to be an agreement at the moment that 2024, 2025 is where we could potentially look at the recovery. So at that point, I would like to start by saying it has nothing to do with being pessimistic, but rather I believe that we really need to know what the challenges are over the next 2 to 3 years. So as investors, as developers, we can plan accordingly. So being more, I would say, realistic is what we need to do. At the start of this, I want to say we will all continue to travel. And offline, we were talking about revenge, Sanjeet, what we call now the revenge bookings and revenge travel and revenge socializing. And that is true. because people are frustrated and people want to be out and about. So there is an element of this. We will continue to travel, but there are certain changes in behaviors that we also have to factor in if we are to have a long-term strategic view on how the travel industry will be impacted by this, but also moving forward by changing preferences.
Hala, okay, don't say everything because I really want to ask you some of the questions.
Sure. I'll pause here.
And I agree with you, what you're saying about 24, 25, because I've been speaking to some other countries and UN, WTO, and they actually said that they were looking at a 7 years time to go back to the 2019 figures. That's what they had predicted. Well, it's going to keep changing. And I think once the vaccine comes out, things will change again. So we'll have to wait and watch. Well, this actually brings me back to my first question, actually, which I really want to ask you is, uh, everybody's talking about a new normal, things will change. We all been, especially in the hospitality industry, I think they really have to do a lot of changes and all that. But what do you think so are the current hospitality trends in the region? Would these, what I'm going to say is not, let's forget the past. Let's talk about today and going forward. What are your, and if you compare them to international strength, where does the Middle East or this whole MENA region stand? And what do you think is going to be the future way, the way forward?
So I personally think when we start perhaps at the global level, what we are currently facing in terms of trend or impact is very much on par when I speak to my counterparts, whether in the Americas or Europe or elsewhere in Asia. And that is, where have we lost business? What can we anticipate and where the pressure lies? But more specifically, when we start really looking at the regional differences, one thing is definitely, I wouldn't call it a trend, but a segment that has emerged and emerged really strong is the domestic tourism. So if you allow me, I just want to spend time talking about this because this is a very important trend that perhaps in this part of the world, we never looked after sufficiently. Specifically in the GCC, the focus has always been on the international market. Whereas if we take the example of this summer, and it's good enough that we're now at the end of the year so we can look back, markets that performed well or better were those that could either create a domestic tourism or had domestic tourism to capitalize. The likes of that is the US, definitely, to a large extent Europe, including the UK, also in Asia. Now, down in the Middle East, we have seen suddenly domestic tourism really provide a lot of room nights in Saudi Arabia, to the extent of room nights where you didn't actually have the enough sufficient supply to provide for these room nights. And that is homegrown, reliable source of business. My personal view also is that Saudi in general, they've realized that this is a market, it's a substantial market. I mean, people didn't travel out, people did travel within the country, and that has supported their tourism. So in this part of the world, I personally think there's going to be in the future more focus on how do we create domestic tourism. That may not necessarily mean just within the country, but more so within that region specifically. How can we package it? So that is leisure related predominantly, but more so from the domestic standpoint. So that's one of the trends that I will see becoming more important. That will definitely also have to call on government support. So it's not really down to individual hotels, but it's more about a strategic. I was listening in or participated actually with the G20 that was held in Riyadh last week, and there was a lot of discussions around how do governments work together to really support the tourism industry. That is a trend that I definitely think should be capitalized. The second trend that we've observed, again in the Middle East but elsewhere, is those resort hotels or adventure product. Whether we call it adventure, we call it remote, we call it exclusive. I mean, we can decide on the terminology. The idea being that it's much more exclusive. It's much smaller, so you're not in your traditional hotel with 1,000 check-ins and out, but rather you are somewhere remote. Resorts that were able to offer this facility are still running to date with 90% occupancy. Actually, they have naturally been transformed into people just checking in for 2 weeks and getting away. So that is also a trend that personally I think is here today, but will continue because this is what the new generation also will look to actually book and stay at. So from a development perspective, it is focusing beyond the traditional corporate hotel, and we'll talk about the corporate segment in a second, but rather into more how do we create experiences, smaller properties, more remote locations. So that really helps the development of the entire country rather than the capital cities. And the visible trend that unfortunately is going to be a real challenge, and while it will come back to a certain degree, is the reduction in the corporate commercial segment. I didn't use the word fundamental change because we will still travel for business and we will still want to have face-to-face meetings. However, I personally strongly believe that there is nowhere in time, be it 25 or 27 or 30, where that corporate market will continue to grow. And that could be many different reasons contributing into that. A, not the least being the fact that we've realized we can do a lot of work from wherever we are. But B, more importantly, I think that the company's budgets have been quite exhausted at the moment. And with the uncertainty and the economic outlook, it's going to be a very long time before the large corporations have the ability to financially support international or regional travel. So that is the trend, that the corporate segment will be considerably reduced, which is a big question mark, frankly, for mostly the city type of hotels and those with large inventory, which again, as you know, in this part of the world, 250, 300 keys is typically what a hotel size. And this is a lot of rooms to fill up if you are specifically focusing on that segment.
True. I agree with you 100% on the domestic part of it to really go through. And I will also go, if I may add to what you said, is I think more than anything else, the domestic tourism also give confidence to the international tourists to say, okay, if their locals are traveling so much and they're using their properties and hotels, then it's safe to travel to those countries. So it's also a confidence building exercise, like I would basically say.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sanjit, if I can add to that, because this is also what we've seen in terms of tourism and the latest trends in tourism or travel and tourism in the last 5 years, it's the incorporation of the culture into that experience. We have seen the rise in people taking trips where they really want to experience and be part of the culture. So ideally, you want to end up staying in hotels where a lot of domestic tourism is actually utilizing these hotels. And this is how you can culturally actually engage in a meaningful travel experience.
Okay, you mentioned a lot about a long staying and regional places and all that, but this brings me to a very important question is, and you also talked about what's happening in the business hotels in cities. What's going to happen in terms of pricing is concerned? Because every hotel has been looking at a certain price. So would this whole thing, long stays and not getting that kind of numbers, will this really reduce the pricing and all that? Would the cost come down? If the cost come down, means profitability would come down, or how does the system work?
I'm going to answer that assuming pricing in the terms of the rates being charged by hotels. That's what you're hinting at. So if we can just go back before the COVID 2020, if we can go back to 2019, what we have seen in at least the GCC, because when I talk about the Middle East, it's important also to factor in that a lot of those countries are either struggling through economic or political instability. So let's exclude them for a moment. In the GCC specifically, we have seen that despite the ability of the governments and the major airline to induce additional travel segments and bring in the business, the rate, generally speaking, has been declining. One, on account of oversupply, but also because there is much more affordable accommodation. So gone are the days when the hotels in the market pretty much could dictate any rate, and if you take it or leave it. So this is a trend that was worrying us, and back in 2019, I've highlighted that. This is a serious concern, especially as we look at hotel valuations. What has happened definitely now during COVID is that these hotels that remained operational, 50% have closed down. Some of them are reopening at the moment. Those that remained operational, only very few really were able to position themselves as the getaway hotel, and they were able to secure occupancy as well as very decent rate. The majority of the others, they went out, understandably, with promotions and marketing and trying to just at least bring in people with very little left in the room rate, because with all the packages that were there, come and stay and get your F&B voucher, come and stay and get access to this. There was nothing left. Now, my concern, again, you could do that if it's, if it's a 3 month period, 6 month period, while you wait for the issue to resolve. With COVID and with this current circumstances, the fact that travel hasn't resumed internationally and globally by the end of the year, we're going to likely face this challenge for the next 12 and 18 months. It will not be profitable to continue operating in this model. And this is where these owners will seriously have to consider, and operators as well. Do we continue? Can we afford to continue? There's as minimum as you can charge, and there's as little as you can cut on your costs. I think for most part, the hotels are operating with very lean structure. They've reduced significantly their costs base, but I'm not sure whether there's going to be that point in time when a decision has to be made as to whether maintain the rate, even if we're going to have to lose, but we cannot afford to undersell, or alternatively close down in waiting, or potentially looking at converting the space. And there will be those instances in which a hotel is considered to be unlikely to ever recover to levels which would be satisfactory in terms of profitability, and could be an opportunity to convert that space into other type of uses.
But what do you think are the majority of the hotels looking at? Are they going to say, let's reduce the pricing and get the people in, or do we maintain that and take the hit? Which way are they going?
And again, this is quite a tricky question, I'll tell you frankly, because with the current circumstances, even if you were to discount, that doesn't necessarily going to mean that you're going to get the people to stay. And we've seen that, and we've observed that even with hotels that open. Even Emirates Airline, that day they made an announcement that they will be flying to different destinations, and they actually went, to support the travel by facilitating testing and tracing and the insurance on travel. It did obviously impact positively, but not to the extent where you would say this is sufficient to run a profitable operation. So I guess what I'm saying is, my concern is if you don't have the demand, there's no point discounting. And my advice usually is hold off discounting. If the demand is there, they would then afford a reasonable price point. But by discounting heavily doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to make this booking. It is quite complex, because we did a guest and traveler sentiment survey a few months back. And to get people to actually engage in decision-making, to book a trip and to travel out, it is a very complex process that really depends on a number of family members getting comfortable with the travel, the flight, the corona. And they're so complex that the decision-making is not as simple as it used to be, unfortunately, in the past, that we've got a holiday coming up, let's book and travel.
Okay, fair enough. I agree with what you're saying. Okay, but then this brings me to the biggest disruptor, which recent years, which the hotels are facing, was the Airbnb. They were the bungalows which people would take, or the self-service apartments, and some of the small niche boutique hotels which came up. What happens in this kind of situation? Where do they go, or are they still going ahead and getting business and taking it away from the hotels? How's that moving around?
I mean, if I could reference the research, because that had an insight that I could relate it back to the people that took the survey. At that point in time, when we asked them about their preference on where to stay, Airbnb was their least preference. The majority of people wanted to go back home and stay with families. So that tells you that if they were going to travel, it wasn't going to be for business or for leisure. They wanted to check in with their families. This has changed over the last couple of months, granted. But when it came to the type of accommodation, definitely staying with the international operators had a much higher preference than staying in Airbnb. With this finding, however, to answer your question, I definitely think Airbnb was a serious disruptor. Again, it goes to say that this is not the very first challenge the hospitality industry is facing. We've been along the years facing those disruptors, and this is why we should be prepared that even if we overcome this today, we should be prepared for the next 10 years. But Airbnb definitely is gaining popularity, and more so over this summer, the choice has been, when people did travel, to stay at Airbnb whenever that option was available. It does seem to me, and that's a personal evaluation of what happened, if the government has been has been considered to have maintained the pandemic in an efficient manner, and there are policies in place, the operator versus Airbnb didn't play a key difference in the choice of the product. So the traveler had a preference to stay at the Airbnb, and it will continue to be the case. That's it. Again, when we look at the potential competition, yes, they will compete, and there's going to be also more because the real estate market has come under a lot of pressure as well. So there's going to be more inventory, and therefore the pool of Airbnb is going to even grow larger.
But I agree with what you're saying, but at the same time, don't forget the gain of Airbnb. Airbnb is the loss of the hotels to a great extent. But having said this, what about, for example, even now you say that people want to travel and stay in Airbnb. What happens to the pandemic in terms of the security or times of the cleanliness and whatever you have over here? So would Airbnb give you the same levels of cleanliness and hygiene compared to a hotel?
If you allow me, I not to answer directly this question, because it's going to be also a function of what security is in place towards hygiene and cleanliness at the Airbnb. So it is being assumed that any Airbnb that will be booked is on par with the hotel. So this is when I made the comparison. However, from a guest confidence standpoint, this is what I said earlier on. Guests were not comfortable staying at Airbnb because the perception of hygiene, of safety, of being monitored, and of implementing or following through is not as high as the hotels. Hotel operators within the first, say, 4 to 6 to 8 weeks have come out to say exactly what they intend to do, how they intend to address the challenge, and how they're going to intend to address the concerns of traveler. So it is valid in the sense that operators have been able to address better and provide that confidence to the traveler. This is at least in the short term. But however, in the longer term, say by mid of 2021, I would expect that as travelers become a bit more confident with traveling, and also with the government implementation of certain security checks, that Airbnb will gain popularity again. The longer run, Airbnb was set to compete further with the hotel industry.
Okay, let's move on now a bit on a different way. Before the pandemic actually hit us and the way things happened, I remember reading articles where they talked about a humongous amount of investment in the hotel projects. And in this whole region, a lot of hotel projects, hotel rooms were under construction and were being ready and to be made and to start work. What happens to them? Do they all stop? Do they continue? What's happening with the extra rooms and hotels coming up?
So again, if I could take this discussion back 10 years to do some comparison, I remember back in 2010, we had very similar conversations about the UAE and specifically Dubai, when everyone was talking about the Dubai land and how many hotels would come into Dubai land, and Sheikh Mohammed city and how many hotels would come in there. And I used to read 6-digit numbers about 100,000 more hotel rooms that will come into the market. And my view then was that it's great to be ambitious. The truth of the matter, if we get 40 to 50,000, which is roughly 40 to 50%, then I think this will be sustainable. Fast forward, of the 100,000 that were committed back in the days, only 40,000 or 45,000 hotel rooms came into the market. So it is not uncommon that these big numbers are out there. Because there are serious studies that will go to support them, or otherwise not to support the development opportunity. Some of these projects will never obtain financing, and some owners actually change their minds. So what's happening today in 2020, even if we weren't faced by COVID, the number of new supply, I would always half it. So if we were looking at 20,000 hotel keys, I'd probably say 10,000 hotel keys. With the now COVID, my guess is those that are under construction will continue, because by the time they open, hopefully this is behind us. Obviously, they will have to rerun their whole financial model, because what they had expected in terms of performance is unlikely to be realized, at least in the near term. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other projects would be completely stopped or canceled. We have already had many clients write in to say that they've decided actually to put any plans on hold, which makes sense. But this is also market specific, right? So this may be the case for Dubai, whereas if we go to Saudi Arabia, We have been engaged in a number of destinations that last year no one wanted to even consider. And these are the secondary destinations of Saudi Arabia, including Al Ula, including Abha, including Baha. So the development pipeline there is going to look very, very, very different. And perhaps with the domestic tourism also giving them more confidence this summer, is that they realize that they can develop more. Elsewhere, my personal view is that any sensible owner will probably, if they haven't invested already a large chunk of their investment, that they would hold off any future developments. But with that said, I don't want to be misunderstood that there isn't a development opportunity. I still think the UAE and elsewhere in the region, identifying and building the right hotel product will have potential and will eventually become attractive and popular. It's just about what additional hotel supply do we need into the market? Where are the gaps and how are we going to fill those gaps rather than competing with the current inventory that is in the market?
But tell me one thing, it's very well you said that this is the way the fall is going to be, but don't forget a hotel project can take up to 5 years, sometimes maybe longer to really build. So if most of the people, because of the pandemic today, hold back and they don't invest anything, and let's say you have a gap of 2 years or 3 years before new investment comes into the whole thing, that means 5 years down the line or 4 years down the line, you will be in a situation where no hotel rooms would be available, or all that inventory would be under construction. What happens in that kind of a situation? And with this, I want to add what you just mentioned. You need to be very specific, but most of the hotels usually like to come up in the higher category where they can be well branded and well recognized. So how does this fit in?
Right. So on the second question with regards to branding, and it is also common, we've seen it in developing markets. I've seen it personally back in the days when I worked in Europe, and then I went on to work in Asia before I arrived here in Dubai. So it's not uncommon that you tend to develop the high-end segment initially. Also, when we look at the ownership structure in this part of the world, it's not unusual to actually see that a lot of those properties are a luxury and a high-end. That speaks to the vision of those kind of owners. With time, as they were looking to increase foreign direct investment, we have seen the entry of other type of asset classes, be it the budget, be it the mid-scale, be it the extended stay, or also the 4-star. And more recently, the different type of adventure or ecotourism type of development. So my guess is that there is much more sophistication at the moment. And in the mature markets, these will be led, any future developments will be led by the sustainability rather than cannibalizing, because there is a certain return that is being expected, even from those investors that typically they are not driven just by financial gains. Oftentimes these investments also are to promote or to support a destination or to create employment. I mean, there are more motives than the financial gains, but with also what has happened, a lot of those owners cannot afford not to have any financial gains. So but this is in the more mature and stabilized market. Even the operators themselves, if we look at it from the other end, they have exhausted their luxury brands. They have exhausted their 5-star brands. So if you look at the big brands, they pretty much are present everywhere. And now they are pushing forward with their alternative brands, be it their lifestyle brands, be it their 3-star, be it their budget, but also to speak to the need in the market. So there is the need for this type of asset classes to develop. We have seen huge development in that space here in the UAE. I anticipate the same to happen in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And this is when you are ready to transform a destination into a mass destination. You would need to bring in the different product offering. At this stage, I had forgotten what your first question is, very frankly.
Okay, what I was saying was that they would be, before I come to that question again, I just wanted to ask you, what happens with these new hotels? Would they all go for branded hotels with international ones, or would they be standalone on their own turf? Because if they're going for the luxury model, some of them have done that on their own. So which way do you think that the trend is going to go after this?
I think it's going to be a combination. We've already seen that a lot of those branded properties, simply because they're also coming towards the end of their initial term, there is a discussion between owners and operators. So what we would typically call the franchise model or an alternative model is already in execution at the moment. It's not just trending, it's happening. We've seen a number of contracts that have migrated out from a management agreement into a franchise agreement. You rightly said, perhaps on the luxury front, it's unlikely that the operators are willing to franchise out. But also, I think operators realize very well two things. One, this is a very competitive market, and they need to grow, and therefore they need to approach their growth in a very different way, and that is clear. And on the other hand, I think also operators realize that there are today a lot of sophisticated owners who own multiple assets, and therefore they have built the teams and the expertise to actually manage their properties efficiently and also safeguard the brand equity. So these conversations are taking place, will continue to take place, and as markets mature, we will catch up with what, for example, when we look at Europe, 40% of the branded supply falls under a franchise agreement, and the US, 70% are franchise property. There will be a catch up in the Middle East, perhaps some markets in 3 years' time, others in 5, others in 10. This is just the normal growth that we would expect to see as these markets mature and stabilize.
What percentage would that be for the private sector and in the Middle East? Franchising.
In terms of hotel ownership?
No, in terms of franchising, like you said, Europe was 40%, America, US was 70%.
Yeah, so by the end of 2019, we had 11% of properties in the Middle East franchised. For those that have been signed in 2019, this increases from 11% to 20%. And the set of hotels that we have worked with when we did our study was 1,000 hotels. So we were looking at, maybe 200 properties will become franchise properties.
Okay. Now I'm going to take you back to the same question which I had asked earlier. There is this huge problem where people, the owners who have spent money on various properties and building hotels and all that, are either stalling it or going slow or taking their own time. So there may be a gap before new investments come into the hotel sector in the next few years. So if there's a gap of 2 or 3 years, by the time the hotel really comes into the market is about 4 years' time. So what happens after 3 or 4 years? Will we reach a situation where there's no properties available or nothing coming up? What's going to be happening at the situation at that time when the demand is there?
Sanjeet, I would love to say we're going to face this problem, but unfortunately, I don't think we will ever be in a situation where demand will surpass the supply, simply on account of already the inventory we have. Again, I don't want to generalize. Perhaps sitting in Dubai, my immediate responses are usually Dubai focused or UAE focused. There are other markets, again, as I said, like Saudi Arabia, but even when we look at Egypt, they continue with their development. So there, I don't anticipate a big slowdown. But again, these markets, as we said, they're not so dependent on the international world. They have domestic tourism, they have regional tourism, and then they have the international world. But if ever we are to face this problem, which again, I don't think will be a problem, frankly, because some developments will continue to happen, and we will catch up between the supply and demand. We have to remember that there's a lot of real estate, specifically residential, where it's also facing oversupply situation. If ever that was to be a problem, and this is what I was going to say, is that these apartments are going to become rental apartments. And this is how Airbnb will grow. And we've seen also already a lot of hotels now that will convert into rental homes or rental units. So it's going to be very fluid. That's why I don't anticipate at all that we're going to be really in a situation where, we don't have enough accommodation. Now, it may not necessarily be your traditional hotel room, but there's going to be sufficient accommodation in the city.
Oh, I love your optimism. Fair enough. I wish that's the way things are going to be. All right. I know we've been running short time, but I want to move on. I want to ask you something which is a little different, more towards the consumer today. If we see the airlines today, they have done a lot in terms of campaigning and promoting safety while flying. Everybody now is pretty much under the norm that yes, if you take your precautions, it's actually safe to travel. Fly. But when it comes to hotels, the hotels movement, some of the hotels have done well, a lot of them have not done well, but this whole momentum has not taken off really the way the airlines have taken off. What are your thoughts on it? How should the hotel now market itself to the consumer, ultimate consumer now?
It's a very tricky situation for hotels. I mean, typically we go to hotels for a purpose, and that's predominantly socializing. And this is why hotels, especially in this part of the world, they have so much public space and F&B areas and lounges and pools, and the whole idea is socializing. I think I ask myself this question. If the hotel is no longer going to become or be perceived as the socializing hub, why do we go to this hotel? And this is to answer that, although I'm not necessarily agreeing that hotels didn't do what it takes to assure the guests, I think with the airline industry, it's very different. With the airline industry, the whole process is about airport, where you can have very strict protocols in place, and you're stuck on a plane. Now, it could be 4 hours or 10 hours, but you are under immediate supervision. And for you to be told off for socializing is acceptable. Whereas you are at a hotel and they tell you off for socializing over breakfast or in a bar, you will not necessarily appreciate it as a guest. So this is how I'm looking at it, that it's very complex. I mean, yes, we need to make sure that we're building confidence, we're connecting with our guests, but this guest that is coming to stay at the hotel, it has an expectation that this place is going to be fun, that they're going to be able to engage in all these activities. So, to walk around and basically to tell people off because they're not following the protocols is going to be very difficult to enforce. However, I definitely think there are the elements of hygiene and safety that are expected, and not just in COVID times, more so perhaps in COVID times, but there is an expectation that our hotel rooms are always clean. There is an expectation that our F&B areas are always maintained at extreme hygiene level. But it is very difficult, and I've seen it. I've tried staying a few times this summer, having not traveled out of Dubai, and doing staycations. I mean, you get out there because you want to be out and about and you want to be chilled and you don't want to be restrained. And obviously, for those that are comfortable, that they can apply themselves the right precautionary measures, these are the ones that will book and stay. But for others that didn't even want to go out and see what it's like, it's going to be very difficult to change their minds. And this is what we have to accept. We're not going to be able to influence people simply by telling them it's going to be all right, or we have, those protocols in place.
Okay, but like, if suppose when you went to these hotels as a customer, now let's put it that way, how do I, as a customer, would I know that these hotels are completely COVID compliant? Is there any check system? Are there any protocols which the customer must look at or know, or any certification? How does this work?
There are a number of certifications. I can definitely speak for RAC and for Dubai. There has been a number of hotels have been nominated as safe or clean. So yes, now whether this is sufficient, I mean, to some guests, as I said, this is definitely enough. To others, even with those certification in place, the whole exposure, they're not prepared yet to experience. So do those hotels that have these certifications in place become more popular? Potentially, yes. I mean, if I was looking at booking.com or any website at two hotels and one that is basically saying, we've got this certification, this will definitely help me build more confidence. But for the majority, again, of the brands, they have their systems in place, they are seeing it through. And with that, they're hoping that they will build confidence. You speak to the operators as well, they tell you that these initiatives have actually paid off, that they have received very good feedback from clients, and some of their clients are feeling confident enough that as an operator, they have this responsibility towards their customers. At the end of the day, my personal view, not as a professional, but as personal, there is as much as we can expect the government, the hotel operator to do for us. This is really going to go down to the basic of people just applying themselves in these unusual times in a manner which, everyone is protected.
Okay, I take your point on that, and I know we need to now close up, wind up. But I just last question, which I really would like you to talk to the hoteliers. What message would you give to all the hoteliers? What must they be careful about, or what must they do going forward?
I think this is a big learning that we really need to take advantage of. As hard and as tough as it sounds, we really need to reimagine what the traveler will be requiring us in the future. And it becomes even more important when we're doing investments to evaluate not the immediate or the short, but rather the long run. In general, hospitality assets, we always try to take a 10 to 15 years view on whether to invest or not to invest, with the changing preferences that have already been shaping the travel industry. We've seen a lot of increase in millennial travel or wellness type of tourism. So these are all great indicators that we need to capitalize on. I wouldn't also want to scratch my 17 years of experience in this industry and to say all my learnings are of no use. But my recommendation is we need to accept that what we have learned, we need to unlearn and we need to learn again. Because it's not just because of COVID. I think it has to do with a number of issues and challenges that will be facing the industry going forward. We need to reimagine the industry. For operators, they need to become much more lenient. It's not going to be anymore about the look and feel. Standards are important, but there are elements that will become even more and more important to the guest. There isn't as much liquidity as there used to be in the past. So when you think about all this, you realize that really there is an opportunity, but we really have to reimagine it in a different way. The potential going forward for this part of the world remains massive. I believe so. We still account for only 7% of the international travel into the Middle East. So this 7% should grow to 10 and eventually to 15%. So there is the opportunity, but more importantly is really about trying to understand what the future traveler will expect, their preferences, length of stay, type of tourism that they will do, and really focus the attention to delivering to those needs and preferences.
So constant learning is your mantra, which you want to talk to everybody and learn.
Absolutely.
Understand that. Okay, friends, we just heard the brain from the Harvard Business School as well as the Cornell University through Hala tell you and take us through what's going to happen and what we should be looking at in the future. Hala, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today, understanding your concepts and how it is. I know you did not make any commitments and you did not want to look at it. You skirted most of the issues very, very well, the right way, put it that way. But I think I agree, and I totally agree with what you're saying. It's a constant learning for the hotel industry, and if they have to be on their toes all the time, more so now onwards, to take this whole thing in the future. Thank you so much. Pleasure having you with us today, and hope to interact more with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjeet, for this opportunity. Thank you.